again, YouTube. Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. In this video, I'm going to be discussing an issue that came up on NightmareFuel's live stream last night with the Hawks, which I was invited on. And he brought up the issue of the internet as a total and complete failure. And I am very much in agreement with this sentiment. I feel that for the reasons stated in the live stream, which I will link to below in the description for this video, that the internet was originally touted as, in the early days, the late 80s, the 1990s, as having this abundant potential for serving as this means of communicating mass information, to be the sort of means by which the world could become educated without necessarily having to go to, elite sort of tertiary education centers and universities and whatnot. That anybody, whether they're rich, poor, whether they live, in Massachusetts, or if they live in Ghana or India, anybody can access, all the information that humanity's accumulated basically at their fingertips. I mean, it's a really liberating concept. It's a really empowering concept. It's a concept that, if followed through, if that sort of idea really came to fruition, it could really serve to just educate the world, right? Not necessarily in a formal manner by any means, but it could have served as a great tool for increasing literacy, increasing awareness of events, news, various areas of study and whatnot, as well as an entertainment source and everything else that goes with the internet, right? And though we didn't really discuss this or anything, my sense was that none of us in the live stream have any sort of issue with the internet as a means for entertainment. The issue that we have, right, is that the internet, instead of serving as a means for information and a means for education, has by and large served as a medium through which disinformation is propagated, and has actually hindered the cause of education in many ways. And so, if you were to say somebody, and Reese of Nightmare Fuel brought this up, if you were to say to somebody from several decades ago, well, here's the internet. It has all of these capabilities. What do you think this would do for the world? They would likely say, well, this is going to be amazing. This is going to be greatly liberating in terms of propagating information, making access to information much more easy, making the barrier to education much lower, and ultimately it would be such a great thing for the world, right? But fast forward to 2015, 2016, and then the last few years, well, we've really seen how the internet has simply just been used by another tool of authoritarians and illiberals in the world to disseminate and propagate their propaganda, to co-opt liberal movements, to co-opt Western values, to turn the West against itself. In fact, even though these regimes, they curtail internet freedoms, or in the case of North Korea, they outright ban access to the internet for their population, they will simultaneously take advantage of the internet and use it against us, and they will promote their propaganda on the internet, and they will spread falsehoods, disinformation, and sow discord via the internet to undermine us. And this is something that the government of fascist Russia picked up on many, many years ago. Alexander Dugin, who is this essentially national Bolshevist theorist in Russia, but somebody who had the ear of Putin for many years, and arguably to some extent still has influence over the Kremlin establishment. He wrote a book entitled Foundations of Geopolitics, as well as another, the fourth political treatise, where he lays out Eurasianism and the ideas of basically Russian imperialism in the modern era. What he viewed as the Russian geopolitical imperative was to co-opt the divisions and contradictions within the West and use liberal democracy against itself, because he knew, rightly so, that the government, that the military fascist Russia would not be able to, by any means, achieve any sort of conventional victory against NATO and the West. Our militaries are so much more overwhelmingly powerful than Russia's that they have no chance. For example, the Italian Navy is stronger than the Russian Navy, but the Italian Navy isn't even in the top three strongest navies in NATO, and we have the United States Navy. The United States Air Force, as well as the United States Navy's Air Force, the naval aviation, are both larger than just on their own, they're both larger than the Russian Air Force in its entirety, including the naval aviation. Russia is incredibly militarily weak. Really, all that they have are outdated nuclear weapons. And, well, it's true that no matter how old a nuke is, or no matter how high-tech the firing mechanisms may be, or the delivery mechanisms, that if it goes off, the physics is the same. That is true. But I would question the readiness and the actual capability to deliver much of their nuclear arsenal. So, for all intents and purposes, they have about 1,500 that would actually work, about 1,500 nukes of their 8,000 warhead stockpile that could actually be used in a war, which, I mean, that on its own is formidable, of course, but that's really all that they have. And Putin was aware, or Dugin was aware of this, and Dugin knew that, well, if we actually wind up using the nukes, that's the end anyway, so there's not any sort of long-term value to be gained through it. So he was seeking to basically try to win without having to resort to military means, and co-optation was one of the strategies laid out to basically play to and court the radical elements in the West, namely the white supremacist movements, such as the alt-right, etc. They didn't conceptualize it as the alt-right back in the 90s or anything, but there was this idea that these traditionalist, ultra-conservative, white nationalists could be co-opted to help and propagate the Kremlin's aims. There was also the idea that the Kremlin should also hype up and promote black separatism and progressive movements within the U.S., the most extreme versions of them. Now, those two on their own are completely contradictory and opposing ideologies. The point here wasn't that the Kremlin had any sort of dog in the race in terms of what they actually were going to care about. This is why they supported Trump. It's not like Putin or the Kremlin has any sort of affinity for him. They just see him as useful. And if they feel that he'd be more useful if they expose his financial records, they'll do it. They'll throw him under a bus, because it's not about Trump. It's not about loyalty to Trump. It's not about making America great again. It's not about republicanism. It's not about his brand of republicanism. It's not about any of that. It's simply, who's a useful idiot right now? Who's going to be useful to co-opt so that we can achieve our geopolitical aims? Because the only individual that Putin cares about is himself, is Vladimir Putin. And Dugin is basically the theorist and the supporter of the fascist system in Russia, of course. And so they latched on to the internet very early on in the 90s and going into the 2000s as a means of propagating the Kremlin's objectives into this century. Whereas the United States, on the other hand, the U.S. government never really took the internet very seriously. I would argue that Russia, even though its budget is vanishingly smaller than the United States, they still have spent more on cyber capabilities than America. It's pathetic. The United States really, the U.S. government really kind of ignore the internet. It saw it as benign. It saw it as a means of entertainment. What are people gonna do with the internet? They're gonna watch cat videos and whatnot. I mean, whereas the Russians understood the potential, the Russian establishment understood the potential to destroy the West, to co-opt the West, to radicalize the West with the internet. And it's not just the Russians, of course. ISIS is as well. Zakharwi, he took on the same strategy of him and his buddies over in the Middle East. They were making, primitive videos and everything and disseminating them online of, their terrorist actions and everything to try to radicalize people. So the most backwards, the most troglodytic, the most dark ages types of people will use the most advanced technology of the West to promote these dark age ideals, to promote this barbarism. And they basically will use 21st century technology to promote 13th century values. And that's what's going on right now. And so in this sense, and even though we didn't spend that much time talking about it, the general sort of consensus from the live stream was that the internet has been a total failure because it has served as a means of disinformation. It has served largely as a tool by which these illiberal authoritarian despots are able to promote and ultimately conduct propaganda for their regimes to legitimize themselves in the eyes of not only Westerners, their own people, etc. And I made a joke at some point in that live stream, though it may have been after we went off air. I cannot remember this, but I was talking about how with the internet, it's gotten so bad now. It's gotten so filled with disinformation and dictator apologia and memes about dictators as being, base strongmen, god emperors and everything. And I made a joke and I said, well, it's only a few years probably at this point before North Korea even allows the internet. Because what harm is there at this point? They used to ban it because they knew, the dictators over there knew that if the people had access to information from the outside, they would immediately say, hey, well, we can live like the West. We can live like the West. We can overthrow the Kim dynasty. Whereas now, what do you see? You see memes about how powerful and glorious Kim is. You see all the Kim Il-sung stuff on 4chan. You see Donald Trump going over there and getting his photo op with Kim to try to look like a tough guy. It used to be the other way around. It used to be that the North Korean dictators would try to get a photo op with America so that they could look tough for their people. And now Trump wants to look tough. He wants to look cool. So he goes over there and bows down and gives concessions so that he can get a photo op with a real dictator, with somebody that he envies, with somebody who has more power than he'll ever have, and somebody that he thinks is super cool. And so if you're on the internet now, much of what you're going to see, unless you're somebody who spends a lot of their time devoted to actually seeking out, real evidence-based sources and might even read academic journals and whatnot to try to come to synthesis that's based in reality. Most people will consume fake news and not even question it. And if they're presented with any information to try to take them out of their lull, they will call that Jew propaganda, or they'll call that Zionist propaganda, or they'll call that fake news or whatever. And so Alex Jones, Jared Taylor, Richard Spencer, Dugan, Jordan Peterson, all these people now have fed into this promotion of illiberal ideas, and to various extents, of course. Jordan Peterson in particular is somebody who nominally argues against fascism and communism, but a lot of the ideas that he sows are a gateway for his followers to then go on to more and more radical ideas. And so the internet has served as a means by which people can be radicalized even easier than in the past. It's served as a means by which people can very quickly go from being standard centrist liberals to either being the most radically Marxist communists if they get red pilled on Marx, or being the most, Hitlerian, racial chauvinistic Nazis if they get red pilled on Hitler or whatever. I mean, it's a mess. It's a disaster, and the internet as a means by which entertainment is able to be accessed has been largely successful. Gaming, etc. It has been a revolution in terms of entertainment. But from the standpoint of information, from the standpoint of the internet as the information superhighway, it's been the information superhighway to hell, right? I mean, you look at how all of the information that's available out there on the internet, you have everything from the most well researched, well documented, absolute 100% empirical facts to the most obvious Kremlin talking points, and which is going to perform better online. What are the algorithms going to be biased towards? They're going to be biased towards the one-liner, meme-based, calling everybody who doesn't support Putin a cock, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be biased towards the most non-factual BS. That's what the internet has actually functioned to do. And while it is true that much empirical information, many facts that used to be very esoteric and hard to find are now easily accessible, the problem is that the population in general in the West is not necessarily well educated enough to be able to discern facts from fallacies. And these illiberal talking points and authoritarian propaganda ultimately are able to be transmitted much more rapidly than they used to. So, for example, the old USSR used to fund and promote the communist parties and their newspapers in the West. They got no traction. It was bulky. It was clunky. All that they really had were a few, hipster type coffee fanboys of Stalin or whatever and Lenin that would latch onto it. And now they have the whole, more or less, much of the youth just incredibly in their intellectual grasp, where it used to be the case that, generally speaking, and we talked about this in the live stream too, to some extent, that the young used to be, less necessarily ideological per se, a lot more sort of sophomoric about things, and generally lean more to the left. Well, now it's the case where much of the young now lean towards this alt-righty, 4chan based, meme culture where if you're seen as a liberal, that's synonymous with being, a cuck or whatever, and where Putin's seen as this base god emperor, crusader of Christendom and all of this, even though he has a larger Muslim population than any of the Western European countries. But of course, again, the internet often is a place where you can just buy into narratives and not have to deal with facts or anything that draw nuances into narratives. The other issue, of course, with the internet is the echo chamber issue. And so once you get radicalized into one of these directions, it is very much biased on the internet to keep you in whatever bubble you wind up isolating yourself. And so it's very well possible that if you get your news from the internet, if you spend much of your time, your access to the outside world is via the internet, and you happen to have a very left-wing bias at that moment, it's very likely that you'll wind up actually staying there. Whereas if the internet was not as it is, or if it didn't exist, you might come across sources that you disagree with, you might come across things that you disagree with, and you might find your way over time back to the center. Now, all of the momentum is to keep you where you are. It is very much an echo chamber mechanism. It promotes and exacerbates echo chambers. It makes them increasingly radicalized. And this is true on the left, it's true on the right. And it is the case where if you happen to be somebody who's alt-righty or whatever, once you're in, it's very hard to get out, because now all the algorithms are going to recommend you videos from other white nationalists and other fascists. All of your recommended videos are going to be, Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, Jared Taylor, Red Ice Radio. all these channels that are only going to serve to give you the news from their very, very biased perspective. And this is true on the left too. And so it gets to the point where it's possible that you could live in a bubble where all your news is the Young Turks, Kyle Kulinski, Jimmy Dore, where a statement such as Tulsi Gabbard is too hawkish sounds reasonable to you. Now, of course, Reese and I, we talked about this, how, if Tanky Tulsi Gabbard is too much of a hawk, then what are we? I mean, we see her as the most isolationist dictator apologist out there, right now, that's running for president. But it is true, and it is the case that Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks sees Tanky Tulsi Gabbard as too hawkish. That sounds unbelievable. That sounds like something that you would read in The Onion, right? The problem is, of course, that when it comes down to this, the echo chambers are only going to get even more and more radicalized over time. And if this continues, it's not outside the bound of reason to predict and speculate that in 5 years, Anna Kasparian within that bubble will be seen as conservative, total right-winger, too far to the right, and too hawkish. And it will just ultimately go on and on and on into increasingly insane degrees of crazy radicalization on both sides, of course. And my view as to what's happening already and what will continue to happen is that, paradoxically, as these echo chambers become more and more solidified, where it's much more difficult to see any contradictory information to the narratives of those echo chambers, what will happen is that they will eventually start to overlap, because of course the far right and the far left cross over at some point. I view the political spectrum, of course, as a circle, right, with the center at the top and fascism and communism meeting themselves at the bottom. And they have more or less the same talking points on foreign policy already. And we're beginning to see them adopt similar talking points on social issues. So you'll see this, for example, much of Tanky Tulsi Gabbard's fan base will identify with her, but at the same time talk about, gays as being degenerate or feminists as being degenerate, and have the very much exact same language as the alt-right, which is nominally supposed to be on the opposite end of the spectrum from somebody like Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, where they'll have the same social views as Jared Taylor or Richard Spencer, but yet support progressive like Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, for example. This overlap is already starting to happen, and it is not going to result in some sort of centrist synthesis where if you mix the extreme right and the extreme left and they come together, that will resolve itself so that people kind of adopt a middle position. That's not what's going to happen. They're going to take the most crazy stuff from the left and the most crazy stuff from the right and have both of those. Like, it's not like you're going to mix insane right-wing fascist stuff with insane left-wing communist stuff, and you're going to come out with a centrist capitalist who has a pretty liberal outlook on the world. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that you're going to have people that have a lot of fascist views and at the same time harbor a lot of communist views. I mean, the whole Nazbol gang thing is being a meme. Well, I mean, realistically speaking, Alexander Dugin is basically an unironic Nazbol, and he has the ear of Vladimir Putin, who is arguably, right now at least, the most powerful person in the world, because the U.S., even though the U.S. has much more harder military power than Russia, refuses to use it, always backs down, never stands up for its ideals, for its allies, etc. We are run and governed by isolationists, and in this era of cringe, this political and geopolitical era of utter cringe and isolationism, it is the case that the leader of a backwater with a fairly weak military that's outdated and underfunded can be the most powerful person in the world because we let him. And this is the issue of the internet. This is the problem with having access to information with no barrier to entry. It can be a very good thing or it can be a very bad thing, because no barrier to entry also means that there's not going to be much critical thinking involved. It means that anybody can access it and leave it at any time. They can only see the information that fits their narrative and then go on with their lives without seeing an opposing viewpoint. Whereas in traditional universities, if you were exposed to a viewpoint, in theory, you should also be exposed to another viewpoint and argue and play devil's advocate and see both sides. Whereas now, the internet as a means for education is ultimately a means for propaganda. It's a means for the propagation of disinformation. It is a tool to assist and promote the most disgusting and egregious despots in the world, the most backwater, dark ages mentality with the most advanced and incredible technology that humans have ever produced. It is a duality of worlds. It reminds me, the internet in some ways, as it has manifested itself and as it has degenerated into, reminds me of an image I saw. And it was a decapitated Saudi citizen who had been executed, and they had hung up the body as a symbol to the rest of the population to be good or whatever. And the most dark ages, barbaric display of cruelty and old world thinking. And right in the background is this modern glistening skyscraper. And there's this brand new helicopter flying overhead, like modern technology. I mean, and you're like, how can these exist side by side? You have the dark ages with the 21st century right there. The internet in many ways resembles that and is becoming increasingly and increasingly more 21st century platform for 13th century information. And it's disgusting. And I agree with Reese of NightmareFuel that the internet, as it relates to being a source for information, has been a total and complete failure. So thank you for watching, YouTube.